Welcome to MyLife, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
A good tevach, a good week. We continue our journey in the life-changing Sefer HaTanya. This program is made possible by Rena Lights LLC, and it is in honor and memory of Rabbi Yosef Halevi Weinberg, Olav Shalom, Rabbi Moshe Pinchas HaKoyen Katz, Olav Shalom. It's also the schus and the merit of Rabbi Zev Yecheskel HaKoyen and Risha Katz, Le'erich Yomim B'Shanim Tevis, for many healthy, long years. So we are now in the beginning of Perek Beis, the second chapter in Tanya, identifying, describing the divine personality within each Jew. That after explaining that there's one soul, which is called the Nefesh Habam, is the animal soul, which means its primary focus is survival, existence. Klipas Nega, the divine is concealed like fruit inside of a shell, inside of a peel. We're now talking about the Chelik Elokam Emal Mamash, Nefesh Hashenis B'Yisrael, that second soul, which is a piece of godliness. And as we explained at length what that means, and Mamash literally, and the Alter Rebbe explained it by using different references in the verses, right in the beginning of the creation of Adam, Vayipach Ba'apav Nishmas Chaim, that he imbued, instilled, breathed from the very inner dimensions of the divine, Kav Yochel, because all this is in the language that we can relate to, that is in contrast to the rest of existence, which was created by God's words, B'dvar Hashem, Shemayim Nasu, B'asara Ma'amoras Nivra Elam, God's words, the neshama within Adam came from Vayipach, through Vayipach, through a breath that comes from the Teich Yusi V'atzmusei, the very innermost place that requires that intensity to blow forth the neshama. Then the Alter Rebbe continued and explained Yisrael Ola B'machshava, not just dibur, machshava, thought. Just like in a human being, thought reflects the inner personality of the individual. So too the neshamas arose in thought. And that's where they originate from. The truth is, it says nimshachis min machshavte. It doesn't say nishavu min machshavte, which means they really originate higher, but they manifest in thought in that highest level in contrast to dibur, speech. And then the third point, that's like a ben from atzmir sa'av, that a neshama is like a child that comes from the very essence of its father. And all this we explained at length. B'ni b'ched Yisrael, bonim atem la'Hashem Elokechem, k'mo she'aben nimshach b'moyach ha'av, kach kav yochel nishmas kol ish Yisrael, nimshach b'machshavte v'chachmoshe yizbarach. So it's coming from the thought and the mind, which, so to speak, kav yochel is connected to the divine, like our minds are connected to our soul. They reflect the very essence of our soul. But here comes the question, which we've addressed, and that is, chachmosei, chachma is a faculty. Even by a human being, it's not the essence of the soul. And for sure by the Eibishter, it's not. So how could we say that that's reflected chelik elokam emal mamash? Literally, an expression of the very divine essence? So the Alter Rebbe continued and said that the iyu chakim v'lei b'chachmi yediyah, that God's wisdom is unknowable to us, which means it's a different category of wisdom. And that category of wisdom is Elohu v'chachmosei echad. By a human being, our faculties, our minds understand and comprehend things outside of us. By the Eibishter, you can't say it's outside of him, God forbid. So it's him and his chachma is one. How is that possible? Because that's a different level of chachma, as the Rambam says, hu amada, hu yedeya, v'dov zein b'yechelas adam lehavina al burya. Why? Because it's a very unique element that God's faculties connect with the God divine itself. So we discussed in the last year, in the last class, this paradox. Because on one hand, Elikus is pshitas betachlis hapshit, poshet betachlis hapshitas, in the words of the Maral in his introduction to Gvuras Hashem. That God is completely shapeless and seamless. And yet, the Eibishter wanted to create a structured world. And a structured world, by definition, is not shapeless. It has a shape, and it has definition, it has parameters, it has structure. So when we're talking about existence, the structure of existence, so we say it's a creation of God, and therefore it's not chelik elikam mal mamash. You don't say that on Dem Tzemei Chai. You don't say that on all of creation. You say it's a creation of God, but you don't say it's a reflection of the very essence of the divine. But by a neshama you do say that. Because as we discussed, the neshama has to have properties that are able to transform this world and bring godliness to this world. That's the whole point of the chelik elikam mal mamash. The nefesh habam is, so to speak, similar to existence. And it's driven by the divine that's concealed like in a shell. But the nefesh elikis is revealed godliness, which means that it's a godly personality. Its whole personality is transcendence, the capacity and ability to stand above the world. So the human being, the Jew, has both these nefashas, but the nefesh elikis gives him the power to transform the world into adira b'tachtenim and bring godliness. So the neshama has to have two aspects to it. One is that it's rooted in this godliest, deepest godly place, vayipach, machshove, chachmosei, which is united with God, like the ben that comes from the etzem moyach ha'av, but it also has to come into a structure. Because if the neshama remains pshitus, completely shapeless, it can't enter into a body and enter into a world which is defined by shape. So that's why it's so vital to understand how do you then reconcile that. So hu v'chachmas echad is so critical here. So though we don't fully understand it, as the Rambam says, and Alter Rebbe quotes it, because lo machshavei sechem and so on, nevertheless, that's the fact, and that helps us bring the bridge of these two extremes. That on one hand, it's pshitus, on the other hand, it manifests in some form of structure, which what we'll call vayipach, we'll call it machshavte shall use all of machshavte, and we'll call it like a ben that's nimshach b'me'ach ha'av. It's not the av, it's a ben, and a ben is nifrit. He's separate from the father, but he carries the very DNA and essence of the father. So now comes the Hagah that the Alter Rebbe now adds. So if you may recall, in the last year, I concluded with an introduction to this Hagah. Because the truth is we're touching upon something far deeper than just regarding the neshama itself. That's also deep. We're talking about the very ability to bridge the divine and existence. And the Eibishter wanted a bridge. He wanted a dira lo yizbara b'tachtenim, which means a home for him. A home means that godliness is comfortable in this world. But this world is in every possible way antithetical to godliness. Not just regarding people, God forbid, doing things against God. The very mere fact that the existence is defined and mugbal is the opposite of God's lack of hagbala. And yet, the Eibishter wants both these things to come together. So for this, we have a big Seder Ishtalshalis. And we have levels in the Esser Sfiris, and specifically the Esser Sfiris of Atzilus, which serve as a bridge. On one hand, their structure. On the other hand, their divine structure. And they become the interface through which we can bring godliness into the structure of our existence. So in this Hagah, the Alter Rebbe explains it now in more detail. Outside of that Hagah, the actual Pnim of Tanya, there he's talking about the Neshama. Source is Chachmasei is Baruch, Hu v'Chachmasei Echad. In the Lashon of the Rambam, language of the Rambam, Hu Hamade Hu HaYedeya. But in the Hagah, he now explains it in further detail, and especially how we understand it al pi Kabbalah, not just according to the Rambam. Because remember, the chelik elikam mal mamash is rooted in Kabbalistic sources. You could say the Rambam never says that chelik elikam mal mamash. Of course, the Rambam accepts what the Torah says, vayipach ba'apav nishmas chayim, but he doesn't use that expression. So with the Rambam, you could say it doesn't talk about the Rambam shita bar a neshama. Clearly, it's a neshama that comes from the Eibishter, vayipach ba'apav nishmas chayim, and it says b'ni b'chei Yisrael, ponim atam l'Hashem elokeichem. All these are psukim that the Rambam, of course, knows about. But here it's not so negate to understand the Rambam Shita of Neshama. It's more important to understand the Alter Rebbe bringing the Mekubolim and Alpi Primis Atei what a Neshama is. But the Rambam helps us in the detail, well, it's not such a detail, in this aspect of connecting godliness with God's faculties. Because since we're saying Chachma, we want it to be one, Hu v'Chachmosei Echad. Hu Amad v'Hu Yidei. But how do we understand it on a deeper level? And how do you really explain that seeming contradiction? Is God pshitus, shapeless, or is he chachma? And if it's only chachma, then how could you say chelik alekam and mal mamish? You could say it's a chelik from chachmasi yisbarach, God's faculty. On the other hand, if it's purely, so that's, on the other hand, if it's godliness, how do you define it as chachma? So this is what this Hagah is concerned with. And more importantly, why is Alter Rebbe put in Hagah Ebezeh? Because the truth is that Hagah is not talking about neshamas necessarily. It's talking about Bechlal, the whole existence. How the whole existence ultimately gets united with the divine. Achdus Hashem. And for this, we need to understand the concept of the Esesfiris and Atzilus, as I discussed in the introduction to this Hagah at the end of last class. The reason I'm elaborating, because it's such a fundamental concept, and it's understandable why the Alter Rebbe begins Tanya, literally beginning of chapter 2, because this sets the tone for how we actually can be a bridge between godliness and this world. Remember the beginning of Tanya, Mashbir Neseti Tzadik Valti Rosha. We didn't yet explain what a Tzadik and a Rosha, but means that we have a mission to be at Tzadik. Later we're going to learn being at Tzadik means to bring godliness into this world. So we have to understand how we do that. So now the dynamics of understanding how God created existence in a process where there's a relationship between God and existence is what is concerning this Hagah. So let's learn it inside, and I'll explain it in detail. Now, before we go to the actual insight, I just want to repeat a few points I made already, but this is critical. We're going to talk about several different opinions here. We have the Rambam, who establishes Hu Amad Hu Yedeya, which means that the Eibishter's Yediyah, the faculty of knowing, is not outside of him, which is vital, because there's nothing outside of God. So it's not a Yediyah mechutz la'atzmei in the language of Chassidus. It's a Yediyah me'atzmusei. He knows himself, and therefore he knows everything around. So his Yediyah is one with him. However, as we know, the Maral argues with that. He says, how could you say that? The Eibishter is higher than Yediyah. Even the Rambam says that, he says, Ein b'cheles adam la'avina al buryeh. K'sev ha'cheker alakat timtza. And le machshavei seichem. And yet the Rambam does speak about God being Hu HaYedeya. So the Maral argues and disagrees that God is beyond Yediyah. So first of all, is the Machlekes in Metzias? But the Rambam doesn't hold that God is beyond Yediyah. He thinks that God is defined by Yediyah. He created Yediyah. He created knowledge. And L'idach Gisa, the Maral doesn't know Hu HaYedeya Hu Yedua. So this is where you need Kabbalah and Chassidus to explain, to reconcile this. And it really comes down to this two levels. If you talk about God, the Etzem, fundamentally godliness, is beyond everything. If you talk about how God chose to manifest himself, so in the words of the famous Avedis HaKedesh, Kashem sheyesh lekeche bebilti bal gvul, kach yesh lekeche begvul. And what's the first gvul? The Esesfiris. The God, just as God is not defined by infinite, he's also not defined, just like he's not defined by the finite. And you say he's infinite, he's not defined by being infinite either. That's also a definition. So God has the power to manifest in every way he wishes. And when he chooses to manifest in a particular way, that God forbid, magbil, in any way defines God. It's saying that God can manifest also in structure. B'loshen HaKosuf, when Shlomo HaMelech asked the question about the Beis HaMikdash to the Eibishter, he says, Hashemayim v'shmei Hashemayim lo yechalkelucha. The heavens and the heaven of heavens cannot contain you. Afki abayis hazeh. How can this one little house, this sanctuary, the Mikdash, which was beautiful Mikdash, but it's still mugbal, it's limited. How, if the heaven and the heavens of heavens can't contain God? So how could you say, Hashemayim v'sa'aretz ani mole? How could this one building contain? And the Eibishter responds, say that same statement, b'nechusa. It's not a question, that's the answer. Just as heaven and heavens can't contain me, I can choose. Even though heaven of heavens can't contain me, I can choose to be contained in Abayas Hazeh. Because you can't limit me just in being uncontained. I could be contained. The Medrash Rabbah and Bereshis Rabbah brings the mashal of the Maris Hagdelis, the Maris Haktanis, on a similar question that's asked by the philosopher to the Tanya. He asks him the question. It says, "Ashashamayim v'saretz ani molei," and then you tell me that the Eibishter he spoke between bein badei ha'oren, bein shnei badei ha'oren. So what is that limitation? The Eibishter is everywhere. So he gives the mashal of the mirrors that either enlarge a person or the mirrors that make a person look smaller. The person doesn't change because the mirror reflects different images. It's the mirror that's just reflecting different images. So all this is just a context. It's not exactly relevant to this specific discussion because you can explain the differences, but it gives a certain sense that the Eibishter is pshittus, but on the other hand, he chooses to manifest in structure, and that's where you say, Hu amadu yedeya. Whereas the Eibishter, as he is, so to speak, unfiltered or untouched by this choice to manifest in structure, is completely betachlis apshitus. And when the Eibishter does manifest and expresses himself, godliness, in the maris haktanis, in a form of structure, through chachma bina das, hu v'chachmos echad. Because it's the same Eibishter that chooses not to be confined, has chosen to be confined. Think of it like an artist. An artist can create infinite possibilities, infinite pieces of art. And then he chooses, I want to express myself in one piece of art. Would you say that's Hakbola? No. It's one piece of his blig vul, so to speak. He takes his whole infinite possibilities and packages it now in this one piece of art, in these Esser Sfiris, in the Nimshal, in the moral. So we have the Rambam's, that doesn't bring explicitly the Maral, but we'll talk about it shortly in the Haggadah. Then he's going to bring the Ramak, Rabbi Moshe Kardaviro, the great Kabbalist, who lived in Sfas. And his contemporary, the Arizal, was a little younger than the Ramak, also lived in Sfas. Isaac Luria. So you have here, these different names are all relevant, and they're different opinions of how they understand this relationship between the pshittus of godliness and the structure that God creates. And remember, it's key. It's not just that God created a structure, and you can say, you know what, the structure doesn't have to be one with him. It's true. The nivra itself is a nivra, is a creation. But the Eibishter wanted a relationship, and in context of a neshama, he says, chelik elikam mal mamish. The neshama is not just a nivra. It has the primus of elikus, and it's manifest through chokhmah. So it's very critical to explain how we bridge the two. And with that, let's go and see how the Alter Rebbe explains it. So he says the following. We're now reading the Haggadah in the beginning of chapter 2 in Tanya, which gives us a whole wide picture of, in general, the relationship of God with each one of us, and ultimately with the work we do in transforming this world into a home for the divine. So he says like this, Haggadah. The word Haggadah, the Haggadah is on the words of Kamesha Kosav HaRambam. So in other words, he's addressing the Rambam's position that the Eibishter is one, Hu Amadu Hu Yedeya. That he's one, the words exactly, that God is the power to know and the knower and the known, that the Eibishter is one with that. He's simultaneously all of them as one, a oneness. Or the words he used right before that, Hu v'chachmose echad. So says the Alter Rebbe, V'hoidulei chachmei hakabola. So even though the Mekabolim talk about Pshittus and Ein Sof and Bligvul of Elikus, which means how God is beyond structure and beyond Das and beyond Chachma and beyond any definition, nevertheless, V'heidulei chachmei hakabola, the sages of the Kabbalah concur with the Rambam that he and his knowledge are one. But Pardes Maharamak. As Rabbi Moshe Kardavira writes in his classic magnum opus called Pardes, Shar Dalad, Pedig Dalad, it's divided by gates. Sha'arim are sections. So in section 4, chapter 4, he says that the Eibishter manifests in Das, and then he's one with the Das. Now, what's the Havana here? What is the Ramak saying? The Ramak is coming to say that just as the Eibishter, though the Eibishter on his own is Pasha B'tachlis Apshitus, nevertheless, like the Ramak writes, he says the spheres salienis, the higher spheres that are netzal, emanate from God. Netzal, not nivra. They emanate. Like we learn in the Pasuk in Ba'al Escha, v'atzalti min haruach, which means it emanates, imparts. That's where the word Atzilus first originates. In Pasha Ba'al Escha, when Moshe says, Ma'ayin li basar, from where shall I get meat? When the Jews demanded meat. So the Eibishter says, V'atzalti, I will take from your ruach, from your spirit, because everything has to be nimshach through Moshe. He's the Roya Yisrael. I'll impart it into the ruach on the Ziknei Yisrael, the Zkenim. He didn't say, we'll delegate others. He will take from the ruach of Moshe and emanate from it to the Zkenim, and they will be so-called the conduit through which these Amshachis Gashmim of the Basar will travel. So Chassidus, Kabbalah, and Chassidus explain, this is the level of Atzilus. It emanates from the divine, so the divine is beyond any structure, but it emanates, and such, these Spheres Salienis are not separate. They're actually, in the language of the Rambam, Hu Amada Hu Yedeya. And as the Alter Rebbe explains later, when you look at Shari Yuchad V'Amunah, the second section in Tanya, beginning of chapter 8, he says these words. He says, just like with Yediyah, the same as with all the midas, all the attributes of the divine, where you say Chanun, Rachum, Chosid, Ukiyetze Behen, meaning every one time we say an expression, how could you say that God is a Chacham? How could you say God is a Rachum or a Chosid? That's giving him a certain attribute. So the answer is that God manifests and is one with these attributes. Now the truth is, there's a day in Kabbalah, this is the Rakanti, famous Rabbi Menachem Rakanti, who says that, how could you define attributes to God? So he says it's Al Shem HaPu'ulas. It's God's actions. That God doesn't really have any specific definitions, but he can act. And according to his actions, that's the way the definition is applied. But the Ramah goes deeper and says it's not just actions, because actions can be like instruments, like the instruments of an artist. He uses a paintbrush, or of a carpenter, a hammer, a chisel, and so on. Here we can't say that because there's nothing outside of godliness. So you have to say that the essence of these faculties are united with God, but God is truly higher than them. So the Ramak, that's Heidelei, the Chachmei HaKabbalah, the beginning of the Hagah. So Hakol Achdus Pshuta, the Alter Rebbe writes, Mamish Shehi Atzmusei Mohusei. He's one with his faculties, basically saying that these faculties are all divine expressions, and therefore with that they're one with the divine. In some places in Chassidus it explains, because the truth is, it only appears as a structure. The truth is, it's all a part of God's bleakful abilities. Some places it discusses the actual structure, they are a structure, which we'll talk about in a moment in the words of the Arizal. So that establishes what the Ramak says. Okay. Now comes the question, what about the Arizal? So the next words the Alter Rebbe says, V'gam lefi Kabbalah Sari, says like this. V'gam lefi Kabbalah Sari zechrenu levracha, and even according to the Rihanna Kabbalah of Arizal, so he's going to say, Yetziva Milsa. It also can be reconciled. And before we explain how, what does that Arizal say that the Ramak doesn't say? When he's now introducing also Gam Lefi Kabbalah Sari, so that he adds another dimension in Kabbalah itself that the Ramak does not talk about. That he introduces the concept Seidat Tzimtzum, the Tzimtzum Harishan. What was the Tzimtzum Harishan? The Tzimtzum Harishan is a chidush of the Arizal, it says. A chidush has to be understood. That doesn't mean that Arizal came up with the concept. It was there from the beginning. And the Zohar indicates and hints to it. But the Arizal revealed it, so to speak. To the point that it says in some Sfarim, in some Sifrei Chassidus, by Morich Chassidus, it says, Ramak lo yoda me'inin ha-tzimtzum. The Ramak did not know about the tzimtzum. Basically, it wasn't revealed to him. So the Ramak's explanation of the divine uniting with the structure has a limitation because the tzimtzum is not introduced. What's the chidush of the tzimtzum? The tzimtzum addresses a major problem. The problem that we've been talking about. God at the end of the day is shaloi be'erech and completely infinitely distant from everything in existence, including the structures as we discussed. So how ultimately do we understand that if God manifests himself in the structure, as we're talking about, hu yadehu amada, but what do you do with the ein arech, that God is completely beyond it? Is that part of the equation or not? So according to the Ramak and other Mekubalim, you say, you know what, that's off limits. We can never arrive there, we can never touch it. But the Arizal, by explaining that Simpson, what is the Simpson? Simpson is telling us that there's a quantum leap, that there's the state of the divine revelation that doesn't leave room for anything. And there's complete shapelessness. But the Eibishter in his infinite power has the ability to make a Tzimtzum. What does the Tzimtzum do? The Tzimtzum conceals that divine consciousness, that infinite divine consciousness, and leaves room for another consciousness. Which of course explains a fundamental question. The fact that we exist, is it real or not real? Is it just because God is concealing himself? So the Tzimtzum says that Tzimtzum is a real force that allows for independent consciousness like us to emerge. So what does that resolve? That resolves that, you know what? The Ein Sof of godliness always remains intact. It did not become part of the structure. And yet it's part of the structure once we understand the Tzimtzum that tells us that it's completely infinitely apart. So now, according to the Arizal, that says this whole Tzimtzum, you could think, you know what? Maybe here we don't have Hu Chachmas Echad. Hu Chachmas Echad. Because Chachma comes after the Tzimtzum. According to the Ramak, we're not talking about a Tzimtzum, so you could say Chachma has some shtavus, some comparison, something in common with the Elokus that's beyond structure, that's from where it emanates. But according to the Arizal, all the emanation of the spheres is basically after the Tzimtzum. So then you could say, so one second, how could you say Chelik Elikam Emal Mamish? It's all after the Tzimtzum. So that's why the Alter Rebbe says, you could also reconcile it. And how? The Seid, his slapshus Eid Ein Sof, Baruch Hu Ayidei Tzimtzumim Rabim, Bekelim, the Chabad Atzilus. Because according to the Arizal, there's now, once the Tzimtzum, once Eid Ein Sof comes after the Tzimtzum, it doesn't remain apart. It manifests itself through the Eidus and Kelim of Atzilus. Iyu v'chayu echad, iyu v'garmu echad, they're all united. So now, according to the Arizal also, where there's a Tzimtzum and that quantum leap and that paradigm shift, that through the many Tzimtzumim, in addition to the Tzimtzum Arishan, now you can explain how the structure is a divine structure, and that the neshamas coming through Chachmosei are united with godliness. But to go into this further, we will learn this in the next shir, explaining how that exactly works. So we've learned most of the Haggadah. We'll still finish it next year. And the bottom line lesson that we learn from all of this is the critical importance of understanding that even as we are in our defined existence, we connect with the undefined of Elokus. The question is, in what form or fashion? And that's the difference between the Rambam, the Ramak, Heidule, the Ramak, and now, even further, the Arizal as well. So we'll discuss it further in the coming shir. All these shiurim can be accessed at tanyaapplied.com. You can also submit your questions. Everyone be well and have a good tavach.
This has been My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit chasidusapplied.com for archived classes and more resources.